Welcome to another interesting class on commerce. My name is Vanessa Hart. The topic for today's class is Transportation Part 1 in the theme Aids to Trade. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain the meaning of transportation. You should be able to list the importance of transportation. You should also be able to describe the various forms of transportation. And lastly, you should be able to enumerate the merits and demerits of various forms of transportation. The efficiency of trade and commercial activities around the world today largely depends on transportation. In the past, wheelbarrows, donkeys, horses, chariots, etc. were used as means of conveying goods and people from one place to another. Though these were not the safest and most efficient means of transportation, presently, other means of transportation such as airplanes, ships, cars have been used to replace those means of transportation. Now you may want to ask, what is transportation? Generally, transportation is the movement of goods and persons from one place to another. But in commerce, transportation is defined as the movement of goods and services from the manufacturer to the final consumer. In addition, commercial activities are said to have taken place when goods are conveyed from the seller to the final consumer, aided by a means of transportation. So it is safe to say that successful commercial activities have taken place when goods are conveyed from one place to another in a timely manner and using the appropriate means of transportation. Also know that the various means or forms of transportation, such as land, sea, and air, play vital roles in successful commercial activities. Now let's move on to the forms of transportation. The forms of transportation are the various means or modes in which goods and persons are conveyed from one place to another. There are three major forms of transportation: land transportation, sea transportation, and air transportation. Let's go on as we look at these in detail. Land transportation. Land transportation is the movement of people and goods from one destination to another by the use of rails and roads. Prior to this time, land transportation was regarded as the fastest, most common, and safest means of transportation. Now, land transportation is actually divided into two major means, which are road transportation and rail transportation. Road transportation is the movement of people and goods from one destination to another by roads through the use of tricycles, motorcycles, cars, trucks, and so on. While rail transportation, on the other hand, is a type of land transportation that uses rail tracks to convey people and goods from one destination to another by trains. There are what we call passenger trains and cargo trains. The passenger trains are used to convey passengers from one destination to another, whereas the cargo trains are used to convey goods from one destination to another. Now we'll go forward to look at the merits of land transportation. One thing we must note about land transportation is its affordability. Some other advantages of land transportation include: 1. It is fast and it is an efficient form of transporting perishable goods such as potatoes, tomatoes, onions, and so on. Secondly, it encourages door-to-door delivery of goods and services. And lastly, the cost of maintaining vehicles such as motorcycles, tricycles, and so on is relatively cheaper when compared to aircrafts, ships, and so on. Now let's move on to the demerits of land transportation. As much as land transportation has been regarded as the cheapest means of transportation, it also has its demerits. They include: 1. Vehicles used for road transportation usually have a limited carrying capacity and are limited to certain load weights. Secondly, road transport users have been faced with high risks of robbery, accidents, traffic, and bad roads, especially when commuting or transporting goods over long distances. Thirdly, rail transport, which is a type of land transportation, is usually not available in some remote parts of underdeveloped and developing countries. Lastly, for this class, rail transportation operates according to fixed time and schedule. It is not flexible for loading and unloading of goods at a place of choice. Now let's move on to another form of transportation, which is sea transportation. Sea transportation is the movement of goods and people from one destination to another through waterways, either by ships, boats, canoes, and so on. Transportation by sea, especially by the use of ships, is seen to be the most effective means of carrying large goods from one destination to another because of its carrying capacity. Now, sea transportation can be divided into two major categories, which are inland water transportation and international water transportation. Inland water transportation is the movement of persons and goods from one destination to another within a country through waterways such as rivers, canals, lakes, and so on. Whereas international water transportation is the movement of people and goods from one country's coast to another through waterways such as oceans, seas, and so on. Now let's move on to the merits of sea transportation. First, it encourages and promotes international trade. Next, it is a cheap means of transporting bulky goods over long distances. Thirdly, the cost of maintaining and constructing water roads is very low, as most of them are naturally made. Lastly, there are various alternative routes and absence of traffic using sea transportation. Now let's move on to the demerits of sea transportation. As much as sea transportation, especially by the use of ship, is seen as the most effective means of transporting bulky goods due to its large carrying capacity, there are also disadvantages of sea transportation, such as 1. It is the slowest mode of transportation, and it is therefore not suitable for transporting perishable goods, such as tomatoes. Secondly, it does not encourage doorstep delivery, as it requires a middleman for the delivery process to be completed. Lastly, sea transportation requires large investment in ships and their maintenance. Now let's move on to the last form of transportation for this class, which is air transportation. Air transportation is the movement of people and goods from one destination to another through airways by the use of aeroplanes, helicopters, and so on. Without argument, air transportation is the fastest and most expensive means of transporting goods and people from one destination to another. It is an important enabler of international trade because it is the quickest means of transporting goods from one destination to another as compared to other means of transportation. Going on, air transportation can be divided into two major categories. The domestic air transportation is the movement of people and goods from one destination to another by air within a country, whereas the international air transportation is the movement of people and goods from one country to another. For example, for domestic air transportation, in Nigeria, we have transportation of people and goods from Abuja to Port Harcourt. While for the international air transportation, for instance, we have the movement of people and goods from Nigeria to Germany. Now let's move on to the merits of air transportation. Air transportation is unarguably the fastest means of transportation. Apart from this merit, other merits of air transportation include 1. It is a dependable means of transporting goods and passengers to areas that are not accessible by other means of transportation. 2. It provides important support to national security and defense. 3. Its movement cannot be limited by roadblocks, checkpoints, or traffic congestions. Now let's move on to its demerits. Some demerits of air transportation include 1. It is the most expensive mode of transportation. 2. It is not suitable for transporting heavy and bulky goods. 3. Movement can be restricted by unfavorable weather conditions. And lastly, in cases of accidents, this mode of transportation results in heavy loss of lives and properties. Having said all this, we have come to the end of today's class. But before we go, let's take a quick summary on what we have learned so far. First, we learned that transportation is the movement of persons and goods from one place to another. We also learned that the 3 major forms of transportation are land transport, water transport, and air transport. Also, we learned that land transportation is the movement of persons and goods from one place to another by road or rail. Moving on, we learned that road and rail are the 2 major categories of land transport. Also, we learned that sea transport refers to the movement of persons and goods from one place to another over a body of water by canoes, boats, ships, and so on. Next, we learned about the 2 major categories of sea transport, and we said that they are inland water transport and international water transport. Also, we learned about air transportation as the movement of persons and goods from one place to another through the airways by the use of aeroplanes, helicopters, choppers, and so on. Lastly, we learned about the domestic and international air transport as the basic types of air transportation. Now let's move on to our test questions. Question 1. In commerce, the movement of goods from the manufacturer to the final consumer is referred to as dash. A. Traveling. B. Transportation. C. Delivery. Or D. Documentation. The correct answer is B. Transportation. Question 2. Which of these is the movement of passengers and goods from one destination to another by trains? A. Rail transport. B. Road transport. C. Air transport. Or D. Water transportation. The correct answer is A. Rail transport. This is where I leave you for this class. I'm sure you now know what transportation is, the different forms of transportation, the advantages and disadvantages. Thank you for your time. See you in my next class. Bye-bye.